Alright, so I thought it'd be fun to make a little tier list, and we'll start at the bottom with the dogshit tier. So, little backstory, first amp I ever owned was a Raven solid state, and it was the worst fucking amp I've ever owned, and I stand by that. It was super dry, had no gain whatsoever, no saturation, horrible master volume, wasn't really a good pedal platform. Not that I really had anything besides a metal zone at that point, so... anyways, awful. I returned it like immediately after I bought it. Next one on the dogshit tier is the crate. One of the solid state crates, one of the shittier ones. I can't remember which version I had, but again, I bought this when I was like in middle school, and it was also horrible for similar reasons to the Raven. Bad master volume taper, so borderline unusable gain. Like, it was just unbelievably dry and useless in terms of gain structure, unless I ran a boost and other stuff, and even then it was still bad. This wasn't like a good crate like the, people regard the Blue Voodoo 300s or whatever, and the GX 130s. Yeah, this wasn't one of those. This was some real cheap, like, practice combo shit. Bad. Also gets sold like immediately. So basically the whole gist of this tier list is just me talking about stuff I've tried over the years and why I like certain things, and that's kind of how I rank them. It's not that some of these are bad amps, except for the ones in the dogshit tier. Like, here in the D tier, I've got, some amps that are going to piss people off, but that's, this is my tier list. Fuck off. So, in the D tier list, we've got the Rivera K-Tre, and I always really wanted to try one of these, because, back in the early days of YouTube, Rivera posted a lot of cool stuff, and, I was into Slipknot, and Mick Thompson used the Rivera stuff. I think the guys in Shadows Fall also used them way back then. Anyways, when I finally did get to try one, I fucking hated it. It was just horrible master volume taper and super fat, massive low end, which, for a bedroom player like me, some little dipshit in high school, yeah, not a good fit. Is just, without being boosted, it wasn't a good fit for what I want to do. And just wasn't my thing. It had great clean channel. I mean, the thing's built like a fucking tank from what I can tell, like all the Riveras. And if it was just like way tighter on the low end, if there was a way to do that with the Rivera K-Tre, then I would have bought one back then. But yeah, it really made me sad. In a similar vein, everybody hyped up the VHT Ultra Leads, and then when I finally got my hand on one, it was a non-graphic EQ version. Which, for those who don't know, there's two different versions. There's one with a graphic EQ, the 5-band, and then there's one without. And this was a early 90s version, and they've been used by, Slipknot, Helmet, Revocation, who else? Unearth, a bunch of different fucking bands have used the Ultra Lead, but, I've heard mixed things about them. And when I got my hands on this one, I fucking hated it. It was so ungodly dry. And on top of that, it had this weird low mid, inherent bump to it that just didn't work. I couldn't dial it out. And I mean, yeah, I love my 100 CL Pitbull that I have, but they're very different in terms of feel. This particular Ultra Lead, I've been told newer versions of the Ultra Leads have way more gain and saturation, and they feel very different from the early 90s one. This one is insanely fucking dry, and it's basically awful to play for me personally, because I don't pick super hard. I have to really push myself to pick hard, and this amp really prefers it if you dig in, also if you boost it. So yeah, for me, that's why it's down here. It's not that it's a bad amp, it just wasn't a good fit for me. It was one of the worst fits, in fact. And in a similar vein, I've got the Randall V2 Archetype. Similar thing, like Fear Factory, and I think, what's his name? Shit. One of the dudes from Sepultura used them. Whatever. It was an interesting amp. You know, it was solid state for the most part, but it did have a tube section and one tube channel. The cleans were not great, to be honest. The solid state channel was like weirdly low gain. It like would do AC/DC stuff and maybe a little higher gain, but surprisingly low gain, which pretty much left you with the tube channel, which was actually pretty good until I started recording it. And there's this inherent sub-low and low-mid bump in it that you can never get rid of. Like, I ran a 10-band EQ into it, and I couldn't dial it out. It's just some inherent thing with the way they designed the sound of it. And, you know, had I given it more time, it probably would have been fine, but it was just... it wasn't a good fit for me. Like, it was kind of weird and squishy and dark sounding. And also the master volume is horrendous. It was like, this thing's 400 watts of solid state. So it is ungodly loud, which, you know, I didn't have a load box at that time, and it was the wrong amp for me at that time. And, you know, I'd probably come back and revisit it, but for now, just based off of past experience, it goes down there. In a similar vein, we got the C tier with the Super Crush 100. This is another amp that, you know, I got hyped up and I was really interested in, and I got to try it, and I was just kind of dumbfounded at how dry it was, because it's supposed to be based off of the Rockerverb Mark III. And the Rockerverb Mark III is wonderfully liquidy and compressed and just fun as hell to play. This thing was not fun for me. It was like really stiff and dry and surprisingly weird gain structure, like a lot spikier and hairier, like in the upper mids and high end than you would expect. Not in a fun way, like Marshall vibes. It was like more unruly than that, but not fun unruly like my Mesa Mark III. But yeah, cleans were good. I mean, for $500 you can't go wrong. It's still a great amp. It just isn't a good fit for me, so that's why I have it in C tier. And speaking of amps that just I didn't like or aren't a good fit for me, the Mark V 25. This one's mostly here because I don't like the smaller wattage marks. Like, anything below the 60 watt range for the marks, they don't feel the same. That's all it comes down to. It's not that they sound bad. They still sound good. I just think that because they're built around smaller tubes and smaller wattage, they usually have smaller power transformers too. They just don't have the same headroom, and they don't punch as hard as the like 60 watt on up marks. So that's pretty much the only reason the 525 is there. The reason the EVH 5153 EL34 is in the C tier, and, you know, the other EVH stuff is way higher. The EL34 is kind of muddy in the low mids unless you clip that one capacitor. I don't remember the exact value. It's been a couple years since I looked this stuff up. But yeah, when I tried it with the stock cab it came with, which I think had H30s from Celestion. Which, I mean, between that and greenbacks, I think those were pretty common with the EVH cabs. And it sounded kind of murky and muddy, and I don't think it was a good fit for what I like. I generally don't like stuff with a lot of low mids, because it muds shit up real quick. It's less of an issue when you play like in standard, but once you start going lower and lower, it really makes a difference. Also, if you play extended range stuff, which, you know, obviously I do. So for me, the EVH 5153 EL34 is like C tier. It's not that it's bad. None of these are bad. It's just, out of all the EVH stuff I've tried over the years, I would say that's the worst one. Just because of that inherent muddiness, it kind of limits what you can do. We'll talk more about the EVH stuff in a second. So moving on to the B tier. This is an amp that like 99% of people haven't played, but just allow me to elaborate why I put it here. So this is my old Peters body hammer. fantastic amp. It does one thing and one thing well, and that is metal. Yeah, I mean, you can do like hard rock or like classic rock tones with it, but it excels at metal. It is one of the tightest and punchiest, most percussive amps I've ever played. And that negative feedback knob on the front makes it even more so. So there's 2 channels, but they're identical. They both basically do high gain, like medium to high gain, depending on how you dial them in. And how do I describe the character of this amp? It's like, it's almost like Mesa Markish in certain terms, where it's kind of tight and mid-forward, but I don't know. Like, it does the Metallica thing just fine, but it also did, like, you know, Fear Factory shit and stuff like that, which, you know, makes sense given the name, Body Hammer. That's a song by Fear Factory. But yeah, it was a really cool amp. It was just, for me, it was redundant with my Peters FSM, and that was the only reason I have it down here. It wasn't a good fit for what I needed at the time. It was a great amp, and I sold it to some dude, and I've never seen one since. So, yeah. Also, I don't think Peters is building anymore, so I doubt anyone's going to get their hands on another one of these. So next amp, PV Triple X. So this amp is, like, part of me kind of regrets selling it, but at the same time I don't, because it has a lot of weird quirks that are endemic to, like, James Brown amps, and we'll talk about that in more depth. So the clean channel sucks. Like, it's not very good. It's okay. It's not a good clean channel, to be honest, but in terms of the gain structure of the crunch channel, it is, like, very tight on the low end, very responsive, lots of mid presence, good amount of upper mids, and it's kind of got a hairy, like, fizzy gain structure. And it's got unbelievable amounts of gain on tap, like stupid amounts. It's borderline unusable. It's kind of the same problem you have with the 5150, the OG version, where a lot of that gain on tap is basically fucking useless. The crunch channel is the superior channel on the Triple X. The lead channel is just too fucking messy and hairy and basically useless. My biggest complaint about this amp and why I ended up getting rid of it, beyond the, like, hairiness of the gain structure, which just started to irritate me after a while, was the fact that it has very little low end. Like, it's good for extended range stuff and downtune stuff, but, like, you can't dial in more low end the way you think you can. Like, first of all, this thing's got active EQ on the 3-band, so it's kind of twitchy, and, like, it's not a set everything at 6 type of amp, in my opinion. It's kind of, you gotta tinker with it a bit, which that kind of pisses me off. Not a lot, but just a little bit, like, because it's a little goofy. But it's mostly, like, the low end, the lack of low end. And that was a large part of why I got rid of it. You can pick them up for, like, $600 to $800 all day. They've been that price forever. They're great amps, but it just wasn't a good fit for me. And then in that same vein of things that just weren't a good fit for me but are great amps, the PRS Archon. So this was a 100-watt USA version that I had. And, yeah, the cleans are phenomenal. Some of the best cleans on an amp I've had, like, or I've heard, besides, like, you know, some of those Fenders, like the Blues Deluxe or whatever the hell. Or, the Twin Reverb. Yeah, that's the one I'm thinking of, not the Blues Deluxe. It's, like, got those level of cleans, like, great cleans. The high gain channel is kind of like how do I describe this? It's like a recto that's been very smoothed out. Like, it removes that kind of woofy fatness to the recto, and it also cuts out a lot of that hairy sharpness. So it's a lot smoother in the gain structure, and it's a super versatile gain channel. Like, it'll do anything from, like, classic rock all the way up to technical death metal, Like Keith Merrill has a bunch of really great videos with it, and it was a awesome amp. A lot of mids in it. Not really a problem, but it's pretty mid-forward sounding. Good amp. It just, if at the time it was kind of redundant with some of the other stuff I had. So that's kind of why I have it down here in the B tier. As far as the A tier, so these are amps that I just thought were like tons of fun to play. And, some of these I currently own, and we'll get into that. So the 5153 6L6 version. The reason I have this one in the A tier is because it does literally everything like you throw at it. It's, it's ubiquitous for a reason. These are fucking great amps. And I've tried the 50 watt and the 100 watt. And honestly, the 50 watts are great. I just kind of like the increased low end of the 100 watts. To be fair, the 50 watts have better features like the concentric volume knobs and stuff like that. And they have way better volume tapers. But it's just personal preference. Cleans are good. They're pretty good, actually. Green channel, it's good. I like it. Blue channel, I like the blue channel a lot. That was probably my favorite channel. And red channel, I basically never fucking used. I just never liked the red channel. I always thought it was a little too hairy and unruly at times. Yeah, tons of bands use the 5153s. The easiest ones I can think of are Gojira, who've used the 5153s forever, and Black Dahlia Murder. They actually use the Iconics now, but I think they were using the 5153s forever. And then we move on to the Iconics. So this one is here because it's kind of fun as a counterpoint to the 5153s. It's still got a lot of gain on tap, but it's 80 watts, and it's it's bigger and throatier, and it's a little bit drier, and tiny bit tighter on the low end in my experience, just due to that solid state or the bigger iron. I'm not entirely sure. It could just be all in my head. I've played them a couple times, but they're really fun to play. They're just easy to play. That's the thing I like about pretty much all of the 5153 series. And this one's not any different. Plus this one, for $800, you get a noise gate built in and a volume boost. And that's pretty cool. What more do you need? I mean, you don't really need the boost, but James Brown loves putting fucking volume boosts in everything. Burn mode. Supposedly it's pretty close to the 5150 sound. I never had an original 5150. I'm familiar with the sound, but, I've never owned one, and I've never played one extensively. I've just kind of dicked around on them as a kid. This thing, it's great. Highly recommend. Orange Rockever Mark III. Now, this is another amp that I think is fucking awesome, and eventually I'm going to pick one up, just because they sound really good. Clean channel's good. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just kind of solid clean channel. The gain structure of the high gain channel is, I guess for lack of better terms, kind of greasy Marshall vibes, kind of with a hairy, spiky high end, but it does it in a way that isn't unpleasant. It's actually very cool. That's the easiest way I can describe it. It's just, there's a lot of good saturation and compression, so it just makes it so much fun to play hair metal and shreddy shit on it. I don't know how it holds up for lower tuned stuff. I've heard good examples of it, but I've also heard some not so good examples, like when Christian Cole was comparing one to Super Crush. It kind of sounded like shit there, but, that could be the way they were recording it, so I'll give it a pass. Those are really cool amps, and I think they would add a nice extra flavor to my menagerie of amps. Alright, where was I? No, I was talking about the VHT Pitbull 100 Classic. Okay. So, this is a great amp. This is here because I like it more than the Ultra Lead. Basically, the 100 Classic is more saturation and it's got more gain on tap, and it just feels better for what I like to do than the Ultra Lead did. It doesn't, it's still dry, it's still tight compared to most amps. And like that low mid bump that it is kind of inherent to the Pitbull series. This one, because it has the 5-band EQ, it's not that hard to dial some of that low mids out. And I also found that running the depth knob relatively low kind of saves you from some of those lows and sub lows. You can of course dial more of them in if you want, but for my purposes, I don't need a ton of them. Yeah, this is an amp that just, it works a lot better too, like in terms of just sheer aggression if I boost it. It doesn't necessarily need the boost, but like the Ultra Lead I had did, but it depends on the guitar and the pickups I'm using with it, to be honest. And this is one of the few amps that I boost regularly, and it's a great amp, and I love it. And you know, when Friet eventually comes out with a 4-channel Ultra Lead, I'll probably get one of those and I'll get rid of this thing, but until then, this thing's sticking around. Alright, next on the list is the Custom Double Cross, which, if you don't know, this is like Custom's attempt at designing a metal amp, and it was built by James Brown. And it's kind of goofy. It's got, you know, the active EQ, it's got the volume boost that he's kind of done on a bunch of stuff. But then he's got some like switches on there that change the gain structure and the feel of the amp. It's kind of an interesting amp. So there's a clean channel that's pretty good. Then it's got 2 identical like high gain channels, and you know, 3-band EQ, and they've got the 4 switches, the cross switches. So what the cross switches do, basically, one of them adds a gain stage, one of them makes the amp sound thicker, one of them makes it sound brighter, and one of them makes it sound tighter. Now, there's also 2 inputs for your jack. There's a normal and a tight input. And I think Suffocation used this amp for a while, like back in the early 2000s. They weren't super common. They're still not super common. They're pretty hard to find. They're cool amps. They're kind of like a lot of James Brown stuff in that vaguely 5150 territory, but I don't know, it's a little different because it's like it's very punchy, and it's a little drier in terms of the gain structure compared to like a 5150. It's just, if you can find one, they're pretty cool, and I'd recommend grabbing one, but you know, they're not very common. My biggest issue is like retubing this thing. It has 6 L6s, and it's like, that's fucking insane. Alright, so on to the S tier. Now, these are like some of my favorite amps. If you can't tell, I'm like a Mesa fanboy. I love Mesa amps a lot, especially the Mark series, except for the Mark 25. We covered that. Yeah, so Triple Crown 50, specifically that one. I haven't tried the 100 watt. I want to try the 100 watt desperately, but I haven't tried it yet. The 50 watt I tried was fantastic, and I'm like, really good cleans, really great master volume taper. The high gain channel, which, I mean, that's kind of the whole point of this rambling. I really like the high gain channel. It's like basically Mesa Mark-esque, which, if you don't know, is very mid-centric and very tight and responsive on the low end. And depending on how you dial in the high end, can be kind of spiky and hairy, or it can be a lot smoother and mellower and almost like creamy. Like go listen to like Prince stuff. He uses a lot of Mesa Marks, actually. Or if you want a good example of lead tones, like listen to Glasgow Kiss by John Petrucci. You know, he's used Mesa Marks his whole career, and he's honestly the reason I got into Mesa Marks. And I would say that the Triple Crown can absolutely hang with that kind of stuff. In fact, I would call the Triple Crown like basically their attempt at making a Mesa Mark for idiots. It's literally, it's as simple as it gets, and it's a excellent amp. I love it. I'm going to get one at some point. So now we move on to the Mesa Mark IV, which Mesa Mark IV, so like Seven Dust and a bunch of other bands have used them over the years, Dream Theater, etc. And they're excellent, excellent amps. They're a little bit thicker and chunkier in terms of the like overall sound quality compared to like say a Mesa Mark III. Not a bad thing, but definitely more of a modern flavor according to most people compared to the Mark III. Not that the Mark III can't be modern, it's just there's certain inherent qualities to the gain structure that they smoothed out, like that raw like spikiness you get with the Mark III. And they're great amps. Really good cleans, really good mid gain tones, and really good high gain tones. It's like that. It is truly a Swiss Army knife amp. And speaking of Swiss Army knife amps, my Rev Generator 100P Mark II. So I would say the only thing this amp doesn't do well is like classic rock Marshall-y tones. It kind of sucks ass at that, which apparently with the 120 Mark III, they spent a lot of time revising that and making it so it could do that. My other quibble would be that it's kind of lacking on the low end. Like, you gotta dial in a lot of depth or run the fat switch to really give it some oomph in the low end. It's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just in terms of feel, sometimes it feels a little thin. It's a common complaint. Also, the purple aggression mode for the high gain is it's a little like sterile feeling. I generally play on the red aggression because it just feels more raw and more fun. If you're into more like cold clinical, like genty modern metal tones, then the purple aggression, a lot of people seem to like it for that. I personally just don't like it as much. But yeah, cleans on this amp, great. Like I said, mid-gain tones, not that great. High-gain tones are excellent. And my favorite thing about this amp and the way they designed it was that there's not really a lot of weird spikes. It sits exactly where it needs to. There's no weird shit going on. Like, that's kind of my complaint about Voice Zero on the MI Audio Beta, is there's so much fucking sub-lows and lows that it just overwhelms most stuff. And it sounds cool in the room, but it's horrible for recording. It's kind of the same idea with like my Mesa F30 that I have. When I run it in Contour Channel, it adds a shitload of bass and mids. And it sounds cool in the room, but it sounds horrible recorded. That's not a problem with this amp. Excellent amps. Highly recommend Rev. They're really good. So next on the S tier would be my Mesa Mark III. So this was originally a black dot, which if you don't know, those are like the closest to a 2C plus you can get without buying a 2C plus, which means it's got like the same power transformer as a 2C plus, which, you know, like Metallica used. I think Prince had a 2C plus Coliseum, or was it a 3 Coliseum? I don't remember. Night Ranger used them. White Snake, John Sykes used them on the 1987 album, which you want to hear a good example of what a Mesa Mark can do in terms of like that tone. Go listen to the song Bad Boys. It just sounds massive. They're just sick. So this particular one it's got a couple mods that basically change the capacitors and like add an extra volume, which affects the way you can dial in the gain structure, because Marks are kind of weird. Basically, the volume and the treble controls, well, also the whole 3-band EQ is pre-filtered to the gain, to the distortion. So what that means is that, like, you basically, the more you dial in, the more it shows up, and then you can pull it out with the 5-band. But generally, the way people run it, because it sounds better, is like you dial out a lot of the mids and a lot of the bass, so that makes it feel very tight, and it stops it from just feeling honky or boxy. And then you crank the treble, which gives you a lot of gain, and also gives it a lot of cut. And then you run the volume pretty high, and then you like dial back the master volumes, and you get a really nice high gain tone on like the second channel. Lead channel is more straightforward. You can still do that stuff, but you don't necessarily have to. It's going to be a lot thicker and smoother sounding. If you like look up how James Hetfield used to dial in his 2C Plus, like back in the live, like Master of Puppets days, the numbers are out there, and my settings aren't close to that really, but it's that same general idea. In terms of modern context, like bands like Slipknot have used them. The band Sutra, which is like death metal, and I think their last album a couple years ago they used it. There's other bands too, but those are the ones I can think of off the top of my head that have used them relatively recently. And yeah, they absolutely hold up in my opinion with the newer Marks. I actually prefer the Mark III because of that rawness to it. Works really well in an extreme metal context. And then we move on to like my Peters FSM, which is an interesting amp. It's a one-man shop from Canada. This is basically, if I had to describe it, it's like an even throatier 5150 type of vibe. It's big, it's throaty, and it hits like a fucking truck. It's also surprisingly smooth in terms of gain structure. The gain is all very usable, unlike a 5150. The master volume taper is excellent. You can use this thing at low volumes or you can crank the shit out of it. It doesn't care. It's got power response switches on it that kind of control the feel of the low end, so you can like make it feel tighter and more responsive, or you can make it feel a little looser and flabbier. It also has a negative feedback knob, which kind of in that same vein, if you keep it dialed down, it's a lot darker and chewier and fattier. As you dial it up, you know, towards the other end of the spectrum, it gets a lot tighter, a lot brighter, a lot punchier, and much louder. I generally run the negative feedback like, 1, 2 o'clock, something like that. So it's got a fair amount of punch. It has a crunch and an edge knob. The crunch knob kind of adds like, I guess for lack of a better term, it adds some like hair and some upper mids to it. It's not a huge like push to it. The edge switch, that one is kind of different. It seems almost more like a treble booster where it boosts the high end, but it also adds like a certain level of tightness to it, which when I talk about the MI beta, I'll talk about how the brightness switches work on that. Yeah, and the clean channel is excellent on this thing. Peters isn't building anymore as far as I know. He's been radio silent for a couple years, but this amp's fucking phenomenal, and I love them. And if I had the chance, I would buy one of his newer amps, but he doesn't seem to be building currently. Yeah. And then the next one on the list, in a similar vein, the guy who builds the MI audio stuff, James Ibrahim, I don't think he's currently building right now. If he is, I don't think I would give him business again, personally, because he was kind of a pain in the ass to deal with. But the amps he makes are fucking excellent. I like this thing a lot. It's very unique. So this is 160 watts, and it is 3 channels, but you can change the gain structure on the 3rd channel or whatever and make it insane. So the cleans are really, really good. Because it's 160 watts, you have massive power transformers, and this thing, it will not muddy up the cleans, and you won't get pushed cleans unless you really crank the gain, and you really want those muddy, dirty, or like dirty cleans. So otherwise, they'll stay very pristine. You have brightness switches for both the high gain and the clean channels, which in the manual he says that basically by changing the capacitor values for the brightness, it also inherently tightens up the low end. So they're also kind of like tightness switches, which this amp is insanely tight and percussive already. You don't necessarily need them, but sometimes it's fun depending on how you dial in the EQ. Yeah, so with the high gain stuff, how do I describe it? A lot of people describe it as kind of like a Uberschall or something like that, but meaner. And I don't have personal experience with an Uberschall, so I can't corroborate that, but I know what they mean because I've heard Uberschall stuff before, and it's like it's a very like big wall of sound, like throaty quality to it, very punchy. And I would say it has that kind of quality on Voice Zero. I think I mentioned that earlier. There's a lot of sub lows and lows and low mids, and it sounds really cool in the room, but recorded it sounds like shit with all the sub lows, in my opinion. I think that channel's like borderline unusable. I mean, that voice. Voice 1 is basically like a way more balanced version of Voice Zero. So they chop a lot of the sub lows out, and it's just a lot smoother in general. Voice 2 is basically like they call it like the American voice, so it's a little bit more scooped in the mids, but not really. And also it's got a tighter low end, so there's nowhere near as much low presence. I kind of vacillate between Voice 1 and Voice 2. They both work pretty well for the stuff that I like. There's also a sizzle switch, which basically controls the amount of like hair and high-end like fizziness you get. And I generally just don't dial any in because I don't really like that. That's personal preference. Some people do. It does add a certain amount of bite to the tone, depending on how you do it. And, this amp, I think, has negative feedback knob. I think that's what he means by the contour knob, because it kind of feels like that, except it's not also controlling the volume, it's just affecting the tone. So, like, if you dial it all the way down, it's very dark and, like, doomy and sludgy. And then as you push it further and further the opposite direction, it gets much tighter, much brighter, and feels way more aggressive for the stuff I like. And then you can, of course, dial back the 3-band. It's a very interesting amp. You can also run it at 80 watts. The master volumes are actually pretty decent. It's pretty good at like lower volumes with no issue. It's a little touchy at 160, but at 80 watts is pretty manageable. Yeah, so that's pretty much it.